Hello and welcome back to another episode of Church is Stupid.
Comma butt.
I'm Ruth.
I'm Elijah.
I'm here.
Here, what's your other name?
Sam.
All right.
Thanks, pal. So, we're coming off of a really long break. Just for some fun updates for those of you guys who are listening. One of the things that has happened is that in the United Methodist Church, I have been recommended for ordination in June. Sam is booing me. And gosh, what else has happened in the past month? Did we ever tell everyone that we're expecting another child?
Probably not.
That's happening.
Well, you are.
In March. Actually, the due date is Sam's birthday. So, you're welcome, Sam. You're not getting a birthday gift this year. But yeah, a lot of cool updates, and we've just been pretty busy with things at the church between Thanksgiving and everything. So, we're coming back, and we're excited to be back.
Yeah. We're still figuring it out.
It's true.
We're still in the figuring it out stage.
But that's all right. This is episode 73, Sam. And today's episode, in honor perhaps of my recommendation for ordination, we are going to be talking about women leadership. And so this is a topic I think that has been, and still is in a lot of ways, kind of controversial in the church. Because of, sorry,
I think I just hit my mic.
Elijah.
Again. This is going to happen every episode.
It is, every single time.
Definitely.
But it's a topic that's kind of controversial amongst some denominations. I feel like a lot of people, it's really either a definite yes or a definite no for people. I don't know. I don't feel like I've met a lot of like people super in between.
Where do you fall on that, Ruth?
Obviously, Samuel. I was going to make a sarcastic comment, and then I was going to someone was going to soundbite it, and that was going to be the only thing that somebody took.
For sure, that was going to happen. Yeah.
I believe it. I'm a very popular person. lots of people out for me. But women in leadership is something that you don't. I don't know. The Bible has lots of evidence of it, but it also doesn't have lots of evidence of it.
Right.
It's kind of that weird balance, right? And so for many hundreds of years, women were not allowed in places of leadership in the church. Sam?
Probably a little more than hundreds, right? I would assume.
Well, at the time of Judges, what? You made a face.
No, I'm sorry.
Literally, Elijah just made the "and here she goes"
No,
face.
not at all. My face was like, oh, good. We're talking about women in leadership, and then I literally added on to your comment, oh, it's probably more than 100, right? So I'm like, oh boy. I'm already mansplaining on this podcast to my wife.
Took 5 seconds.
That was the face I made.
Oh, I didn't even notice. I'm just so used to it. No, I'm just kidding. But Deborah is a famous judge in the Old Testament who was in a position, obviously, of leadership within the Israelite community. And so I don't know that it's fair to say it was completely unheard of, but it also wasn't entirely common. And Sam, as our history buff that he definitely said he wasn't prepared for, and I'm calling him out anyway, and he's making lots of faces about, tell us, what is a patriarchal society, Samuel?
Let's even define it. Webster, come on.
You got 3 seconds.
Something in my throat, sorry. The men are the rulers, and the women are kind of subservient.
You've heard it here. Sam's opinion on how life should be.
What?
Just kidding.
No.
Reverse.
So, Sam, in history, do you think it's fair to say that there are places where women were kind of written out of history?
Yeah.
And why was that, do you think?
Probably because they were seen as less to like the men. Because they were always if you go all the way back to super far away, like hunters and gatherers, so they were always they weren't seen like any of the like any action or anything like that. So people would just kind of assume that they were just like making food and being in the kitchen all day long, all the stereotypes and stuff.
Right.
It's a very evolutionary, like.
They were evolutionary roles.
Yes. Essentially.
And that kind of stayed true through, I would say, most of history.
The perception of those roles.
Yeah.
The perception of those roles.
Yeah.
And even now, I think it's one of those topics where we feel far removed from it because it wasn't necessarily our lifetimes, the people sitting here at the table right now. But it really wasn't that long ago that even within the United States, women gained voting rights or were able to get a credit card without their husband's approval. And there are also still fun things like, the stereotypes that stay true. A lot of times when women ask for hysterectomies or to have their tubes tied, doctors respond with, well, have you talked to your husband about that? Or stuff like that where it's like, maybe it's not necessarily overt, but it's still sort of common. And the church, as we have talked about many times on this podcast, remains quite a few years behind culture. And so...
You can say that again.
Yeah, just a few. And so it's been something that I think we still struggle with pretty intensely.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I will agree with you as someone who has never had to go through something like that, but also, yeah, I mean, I would still agree, obviously. I think the reoccurring theme on this podcast throughout all episodes is how the church likes to drag its feet when it comes to adapting to new things and to things that you could probably, for the most part, say are should be morally correct sometimes. So.
Well, and
it's definitely one of the ones like the patriarchal system and the way that the church views women is definitely like a long-standing theme that has a lot of changing to do still in its perception of women and specifically women in leadership, I think.
Well, it's particularly interesting because of the way that biblical history has been almost rewritten in the minds of the church to exclude women, where instead of highlighting the women in leadership who are in Scripture, that Paul specifically addresses, and talking and celebrating their ministries, they go to the verse about the gossipy women in the church that needed to sit down and not say anything, which is the one that's most commonly used to...
Even like in my college church group, people bring it up all the time.
Oh, absolutely.
Because I mentioned that you're a pastor and people are like, really? Like you're for that? I'm like, yeah.
You're okay with that? Well, and that's the thing is it's still a conversation.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is so intriguing to me. And to be honest, it's something that I struggled with for a little bit as I was discerning my calling into ministry and whether or not I could as a female, like, I don't want to, I believe in Scripture, and so I don't want to do something that would go against it, but really learning that context of how many other women in leadership were allowed those roles, and not only allowed, but thrived in those roles of teaching, not just of, oh, we're the little support staff who come alongside and sweep and cook and do all of the things. I think of the Martha type women, as you guys probably don't know that stereotype, the Mary and Martha women that are compared. Mary being the one who sat at the feet of Jesus and just listened. Martha being the one who swept up and got everything prepared, and then Martha gets really mad because she's like, Mary, why aren't you helping me? And Mary's like, or Jesus kind of reprimands her a little bit and says, hey, no, this is where she needs to be. So that's the Martha reference. But
I'm sorry,
go ahead.
ahead.
No, I want to hear it.
I was just going to ask if these examples of women in leadership, like powerful women in leadership who had real influence and were big in teaching, are there a lot of like specific names and examples that you could list, actually? Because I'm sure there's a lot of uninformed people who don't know. I'm not referencing myself right now or anything.
So this is where having a Greek concordance will really, really help you. Okay. A Greek concordance is essentially a book that will tell you the prevalence of how many times Greek words are used, as well as what the Greek words are.
Okay.
So it can help because Greek is a gendered language, much like many, but ours is not. So some of those things don't always translate. And so when you look at the names, because Paul often lists names in his letters.
Yeah.
So as you go through and look at the letters that are written, you will see lists and lists of names. As you look at them, you can look them up in a Greek concordance and see, one, where else that person appears. So where else they might have a story, but also you can see what gender essentially is assigned to the name.
Right.
And you can see that there are names that are most likely female.
Yeah.
That sometimes get changed to try to make them be perceived as male, which has happened. Could I give you a list off the top of my head? Not so much, but I can encourage you to find the tools to look for yourself. And so a lot of those lists will include some women in them. There's also the very, again, obvious instance of Deborah. And there's the use of women in other areas. As we look at Jesus's ministry, you know, one of the things we say a lot about the time in Israel and the way God acted and moved with the Israelites is how God was working with the society that already existed, right? The society that already existed was patriarchal.
Yeah.
I mean, again, there were literally laws that said if you kill a daughter of somebody, you pay like 20 whatever, and if you kill a son, you pay 100.
Substantially less.
Like, yeah, I mean, it was just, unfortunately, a part of that society. But we look and we see God kind of working through that by highlighting stories like Ruth. You're welcome. Highlighting even Rahab and Mary. And if you look at the genealogy, it is very, very significant that women are listed in the genealogy of Jesus because it shows the shift, right?
Yeah.
And that's what God did. He didn't just see the culture and say, okay, I'm leaving you here and working with you and letting it be, but instead worked to push on to show what a true view of right relationship with God looked like.
Okay.
And we see, who does Jesus spend a pretty significant amount of time highlighting in the Gospels? There are quite a few women listed, especially when you compare it with the Old Testament.
Right. Yeah.
There's a lot. And even then, we look at the highlighting of the men in most of the prominent men treated women like crap. And that's pretty true of most of our history, not even just biblical history. Right. Abraham literally gave his wife to pharaohs because they thought she was attractive and he didn't want to deal with it. So he was like, lie to them and say, I'm your brother. David and Bathsheba, not a great story. Yeah. Not a great story. I don't think Moses was actually bad to his wife, though. I don't think so. So that's, hey.
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah.
Adam did not respect Eve. At least my argument for Genesis is that he did not respect Eve. So there's sort of that history and pattern. And then even as we come up to more modern examples, the founder of the United Methodist Church, John Wesley, treated women horribly. He literally got ran out of Georgia, at the time, colony, because he refused a woman that he was interested in and her new husband communion. After he refused to marry her because he felt called to singleness, but he was bitter that she married someone else. Then when he finally does get married, he locks her in an insane asylum and never sees her again. Yay!
Yay, Wesley.
So,
goodness.
What kind of Hunchback of Notre Dame crap is that?
I know.
It is, they're not super great stories.
No, yeah.
But a lot of that early church work, and especially when we look at the way the Holy Spirit moves, saying, your daughters will prophesy. Like, it's not just men who are included, but there's this intentional beginning of weaving women into the story much more intentionally, which to us might not seem like, looking from our perspective, it's like, well, but they weren't the disciples. They weren't this, they weren't that. So maybe it wasn't that intentional. But even including them in a way that wasn't the villain or the seductress.
Right.
Or something. I mean, even look at Potiphar's wife in the story of Joseph. Having a portrayal of women to the extent at which they were portrayed in the Gospels was a huge, huge deal. And then further to have that basically doubled down on with Paul and with his letters talking about women who were working in the early church shows that they were an integral part of what was going on.
Okay.
And then if we really look at the history of, especially that first 300 years pre-Nicene, or Council of Nicaea, women were very active in leadership roles. Because, quite honestly, who was home at the time raising their children? So who had the most influence over their kids and what they believed?
Yeah.
So who was building up believers in the faith?
Right.
It was, in fact, women for a very long time. And so it's almost this rewrite to pretend like none of that happened, because what happened, or as the story goes, please feel free to look up the historical context of what I'm about to tell you, because this is what I was told in seminary. Whether or not it's 100% accurate, I leave that up to you. In the early church, women were serving in places of leadership, but there were also very intense temple practices that involved witchcraft, things that were very antithetical to the Gospels, and women from those groups were essentially infiltrating the Christian communities and giving them up to persecution or things like that, and essentially creating lots of problems. So as a reaction, they were like, no women in leadership, because we don't know where they're coming from.
Jeez.
Again, this was shared with me in seminary in one of my classes. But that sort of reaction is sort of what the church kind of overdoes it a lot of times. But then from then on, for thousands of years, women haven't been in leadership, and so there's no historical tradition of it. And it's like, actually, it's more historically traditional to have women in those roles. But at a certain point, it was decided we can't do that anymore.
Yeah.
And then we also have the onset of Augustine and original sin, and the idea that sex in and of itself is a sin. And at the time, who was sex more associated with?
Yeah.
Women and seducting and things like that. And so celibacy became very popular. And oh, poor dear sweet women, they're only on this earth to bear children, so we can't do that to them. So who's going to be the nice priests? Not women.
Yeah, it still sounds pretty patriarchal to me.
I mean, it was, because that was
like that shift that you're talking about. I mean, all those things. Yeah, it's just there's so much of like history in the way that it's been played out, and in the way that women have been treated in leadership, and like you're saying, like kind of historically being removed from. Always just seems to be because of the way that men have perceived them and refused to, or were unable to perceive them in any other truer way. And so, I don't know.
That's why stories like right now there's a Hulu show called The Great, and it's about, I believe, a Russian oligarch.
Okay, I remember watching that show with you.
Yeah, we watched the first season. The second season just came out.
No, I don't remember her name now.
Yeah, if you'll look that up. Be my fact checker.
Yeah.
Sometimes we don't always know where these conversations are going, and so we don't always have everything prepared.
I think it's like Catlina or something. I don't
Catherine?
Remember. Maybe.
Anyhow.
Yeah, Catherine the Great. Actually, I think
Catherine,
you're right.
Catherine the Great, and how she essentially was running this. Basically, was trying to like run the husband because he wasn't really the way the show portrays it wasn't really that great at running things.
Yeah.
And so eventually she sort of works herself into power. And that kind of is a common theme. Even how many queens of England have been more prominently known than their king counterparts, so to speak.
Right.
And it's funny because it's still sort of like we have these examples of women being in leadership, and some do well and some do poorly, much like anybody in leadership. But we just kind of gloss over them in favor of the, like, kings.
Yeah.
And we're like, okay, why not? Let's do it. And the church did that too. One of the earliest Methodist female preachers was a woman named Phoebe, I want to say was her name. And she refused to acknowledge that she was preaching because she believed it was wrong for women to preach. But what she did was go around and talk to people about God.
Yeah.
Wonder what that would be. And was very, I mean, it essentially led to the beginning of the charismatic movement entirely. Yeah. People like that, that's sort of what was happening. Oh, we're not preachers. We just talk about God. Or then slowly as women became, they're like, okay, maybe they can be in roles of leadership as children's directors. Or as youth leaders. Or as this, that, and the other thing. But not a preacher, because we can't have that. And so the lines get really blurry.
Okay. It's still almost, I still would say that I don't necessarily think that you could probably make the claim that even in biblical times that men and women, even though there are a lot of examples of women in strong leadership positions, even more so kind of in the gospel in terms of like, you know, the gospel sort of trying to shake things up in terms of how men viewed women at the time. Doesn't ever seem like they were ever quite equals in leadership.
No.
That got stunted. And now we're trying to get them, trying to become equals again, right?
Well, and I think when I say no, as in they weren't equals, that's because of the society they were in.
Yes.
So they weren't treated as equals.
Yes.
Or it was rewritten in such a way that downplays their roles. Right? Because even one of the famous stories of Deborah is when the war chief goes to her and says, am I going to defeat our enemy? And she's like, well, yeah, you are. And he says something like, I can't remember. He argues with her a little bit. And she says, well, you were going to be the one to kill him, but since you argued with me, now he's going to fall at the hands of a woman. So, like, even within her being female and leading, there was still the, like, oh, here's the great insult of now a woman's going to take care of.
Right.
Take care of this. And that's what happens. It's the story of the tent pegs. Ugh.
Oh, I think I actually know that one.
Yep.
Or something about it, yeah.
Where she pretends to be on her cycle and won't get up and lets the guy stay in her tent, and then when he's sleeping, takes care of her, or takes care of him. So yeah, I think it's fair to say, and there wasn't an equal distribution of power. It's not like there were just as many female leaders and they're just lying to us about it.
Yeah.
No, it's nothing like that. But there are examples of women in leadership.
Yeah. Because specifically, I guess we started this off specifically talking about women in leadership and how they're kind of viewed today. So it makes a lot more sense talking about like all that history and the leadership roles that did exist when you're looking through it of a lens of like of comparing how people view women in leadership in the church that now compared to then.
Well, and I think for me, a lot of the way I go about explaining this comes from the fact that people often refer to women not being in leadership as the traditional view.
Right.
We just have a traditional view of how this works. And I don't know that that's necessarily fair, given the reality of church history, to say that women cannot be in leadership because they have a traditional view. Because I don't think tradition lines up with that. And if that's the case, it is just something that I believe needs to be addressed. And it is a challenge. And as we are looking at nearing the end of our time for this particular episode, what we're going to be talking about on Thursday's episode, look, I didn't say next week. I bet I will at the end, though, is a little bit more of personal experiences with what it's like and how that history has informed the way the church moves today.
Yeah.
Because all of that plays into how women are viewed in leadership now. And I think sometimes we like to think we're a little further along than we are, because it's just much easier to believe that.
Right.
But I think also it's easier to sometimes say we've made no progress, and I don't think that's fair either.
Yeah.
I think you really have to find this medium or middle ground of we're not there yet, but we're working towards it. Hopefully. I mean, I like to think we're working towards it. And so all of this history really just shows a little bit of how the way that the church has sort of seen women, the way that people have seen women, and the way that even secular history has affected how biblically women have been perceived, because you cannot separate scripture from the society they lived in.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Any closing thoughts?
I don't think so.
No.
I think you summed it up very well.
Well, thank you. There's a first time for everything. Well then, from all of us here at Church is Stupid,
Count my butt.
I'm Ruth.
I'm Elijah.
And I'm Sam.
You're silent.
I'm silent.
Sam's silent as always. We hope that you have a great rest of the week.